for making time in your days to join us for this conversation today. So a little bit about me before we kick off. I see my mission to help create conditions, capacity and capability to support relationships to flourish in the workplace. This has always been important to me, and I see delegation as part of contributing to our workplace relationships. So most of the time I work as a coach, and I work one-on-one, or I work in pairs or with small groups around leadership skills and workplace relationships. But today I'm stepping a little bit out of my comfort zone and moving into facilitating and sharing, probably more in a trainer role, this topic of Delegate for Growth. I bring with me, I guess, as well as my coach experience, I bring with me 20 odd years of experience in the food and retail sector. Some of that time I was in a team. Some of that time I was heading up a team of direct reports. Some of that time I worked in peer project teams. And some of that time I led large cross-functional, non-direct project teams where people were all levels, some below, some my peers, and some above me. And it's really from that experience that I'm drawing on today to pull together this framework. So this approach really does anchor delegation as a core element of workplace relationships, and therefore important for supporting our performance, our growth, and our well-being. Not always easy though. So I constantly still find myself tripping up. So even with the experience that I have, it's really important to bring in compassion for ourselves and latitude for ourselves as well, but to keep on practicing. And that's what I hope today will give you a little bit of that practicing. So we've already started using the chat box. I would love today for you to continue to use the chat box. I'm going to ask sometimes a few questions. I'd love to hear and see your responses coming in through that. It gives me a flavour of how you're responding to the content. So bear that in mind. If you haven't got your name written correctly, you might want to change that, as some people show up as 34521. So be conscious of what your name is showing up with on Zoom. We'll use Q&A specifically for questions that you want me to pay attention to at the end. So if you've got a specific question that you would like Robin to pose to me in the 10-15 minutes we'll have towards the end of the session, please pop them in there. It makes his life so much easier to be able to keep track of key questions. And some of you are fabulous, and you have given me and sent through some key questions beforehand, which I'm going to refer to as we go through. We're going to be using the hands up function. So have a look on your control panel and see where the hands up function is. It's normally in the reactions section. And we're going to be using a poll question as well. So a little bit of interaction. And as Robin has said, mostly the interaction will come with what you choose to do after the session. And that's where the workbook is there to support you. So I want us to start off with the first question I'd like you to pop into the chat box. What curiosity are you bringing today? Just popping your answers to that question. What curiosity are you bringing today? How to be better practicing for delegation, how I could do more by delegating. Fantastic. How to do team goals. So quite a few how to delegate without feeling bad. I love that one. Delegating up, well, they're coming through thick and fast. And these seem to resonate with some of the ones which came through, comments which came through on the survey. So how to start, how to improve relationships, improvement, feel better, efficiency, support teams, delegate, development. So fantastic. So it's important, just as we tap into, this is a learning session. So let's get ourselves ready for a little bit of learning together. And the next question for you, one for self-reflection, not one for the chat box, is just really, as you sit where you are today, wherever you are in the UK, maybe further afield, is really to think about how focused are you choosing to be today as you enter into this hour of learning. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how focused are you choosing to be? No need to put the answers into the chat box. This is really just about gauging your sense of self. Are you still distracted by something that's happening beforehand? What else might be going on for you in your day or in the middle of the day? And then noticing where you've scaled yourself. What's one thing that you could do that will help you achieve that score or improve it? So if you just do one thing right now before we kick off, what could you do that will help you improve that focus? Maybe just take a little bit of time just to close something down, readjust yourself, notice where you are. For some of you, that might mean turning off the chat to be focused, to listening in. We all work in different ways. We all have to be mindful and pay attention to what and support ourselves with what we each need. The second question, just before we start, just to get ourselves primed for learning, is to ask yourself, again, no need to put it into the chat, but what level of risk are you willing to take in developing your skill set, your competence, your confidence around delegation? What risk are you prepared to take? There's always a risk with learning. Always learning takes us beyond what we know. Just give a little reflection around what risk you're prepared to take. That might be right now in this session. It might be this week. It might be over the month ahead. It might be over the 6-month development plan that you may choose to put together as a result of today. And my hope is what I can give you today is some frameworks that will support you to take some of those risks, to break down that whole thing of how do I get better at delegation to how do I get better at this part of delegation? How do I refine this skill, this competence, this confidence, etc., to be able to move away from just going, I just need to get better at it all. So your workbook, as Robin has referred to, has all of the frameworks that I'm going to cover off today. It has some reflection questions, and they're really designed for you to use after today's session. You might find them useful to scribble on or to note that you think that one's really important for you, but I would encourage you to stay in the time that we've got together, to listen, to go with the flow, to really sort of let the topic sort of almost like wash into you, rather than trying to diagnose it now. That reflection, that analysis can come afterwards. So hopefully you can stay in the moment and stay present with the group today. Now, some of you have shared in the pre-webinar survey, you've shared your questions, and you've also shared what's important to you, what you think great delegation looks like. And I'm going to be drawing on some of those as well as we go through the session. So let's just move into an outline of what we're going to cover. So I'm going to run through the Delegate for Growth approach. And for those of you who've looked at your workbooks already, you'll see it broadly has 4 key parts to it, 4 key ways of breaking down into different frameworks. And I've used the metaphor of a boat, partly because it makes it visual, it's made it easier for me to remember, and also because when I was learning to sail many years ago, there was a moment of being given the opportunity to helm a boat across the channel in the middle of the night, which was the most terrifying, most exhilarating, and also one of my proudest moments of just seeing where I had got to in my sailing capability. So all of that came through from things which we had done as a team on that boat to enable me to take up that position and helm through the night. So that's why we're working with a boat metaphor today. I also have a thing about rivers and water generally, so you'll notice that from the name of my company. Okay, so as we go through the Delegate for Growth approach today, there are 4 key areas that we're going to work on. We're going to start off with building the mindset. We're going to look at how we stabilize the inner self, what flying together looks like. Remember, this is, if I see delegation as a relationship skill, there is always going to be a shift from the I space of stabilizing inner self into the we space of how do we fly together? How do we delegate together? And then the final and the 4th part of what we're going to cover is calm uncertainty. So we'll be looking at what we can do to calm the sea of uncertainty. So the first section that we're looking at is the hull of the boat, building mindset. This is what allows your boat to float. So the mindset that we have around delegation is really key. What is it that we choose to fill our minds with that then shapes how we see the world, interpret everything, which then informs our behaviors? So let's start with some of the responses which came through from the pre-survey webinar. So I picked out a few themes. I looked at what was in here, and I connected a few things. So development, that shouts out straight away. So there's definitely a theme that some of you are holding, that mindset is around, the mindset for delegation is development, there's growth, learning, upskilling. Those are all words that came through in that theme. There was another theme of efficiency sitting right below development. And I picked out words, there's accelerate, there's speed. So there's something certainly around, is my mindset of delegation around efficiency and speed and acceleration? For some, it's around empowerment, trust, confidence, enabling. It has much more of that, has much more of an emotional response in terms of what does it enable? For some, delegation, the mindset, the words that were chosen, it's about managing workload, freeing up time, time saving, clearing headroom, so thinking space. So again, that brings a different orientation as to how you would approach delegation. There was a theme around creativity, collaboration, teamwork, and points of view. Again, a different perspective to there are a few words of succeed, achieve, and deliver. So really focusing on that outcome and result. So all of those are good. They are all valid. There is nothing wrong with any of those. But what I'm going to encourage you to do to position delegation as a relationship skill is to shift to seeing it as a growth mindset. And the reason for this is well, there are several reasons really. One is as leadership has changed over the last 10 years, I think quite significantly, from more of an autocratic, top-down, power over type of leadership towards more of a leadership that is more collaborative, it's more distributed. And that's been accelerated over the last 18 months, particularly as we've come online. There's a difference now in terms of how we are choosing to work online to ensure that leadership is inclusive. So I'm positioning that within this. The key thing as well is in relationships, and for those of you, we're all in relationship with people all of the time, within our families, our loved ones, our friends. When we allow each other to grow and evolve, our friendships stay vibrant, they stay healthy, they stay purposeful. So really, this is so important that when we take a delegate for growth mindset, we're allowing change to happen in that relationship. So that's a key reason for using this. And there are, the three-way win is for you as a leader. You will come away with growth of competence and confidence around communication skills, conversations, being able to hold that development space, prioritization of time. And that prioritization one is really critical for your skill to resource. So every leader needs to be able to look at something and think, how do I resource this? And that's about prioritization. There's an absolute win for the direct report. They're learning how to deliver. They're learning how to question upwards. And again, this is something that really starts to help shift the power dynamic in relationships, encouraging that questioning upwards as opposed to the, yes, I've got it, when somebody underneath is like that swan and they're paddling away and they don't really get it, but they're just saying yes to go, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to look bad. Owning their own stuff and really building their own skill set around that. And then there is obviously, you know, we are working within the context of companies here. So there is a win for the company as well. There is a responsibility towards the company to think, how do we appropriately use our resource, our time, our energy, our effort, all of that. And we get good quality output. We get growth of that. We get reduction of lost time. So much time is being lost at the moment, particularly now we've all switched to a more virtual or hybrid way of working through miscommunication. So clarity of communication in relationships is really, really critical, particularly now with the pandemic and the situation we find ourselves in. Save costs, all of that, and nurturing internal talent rather than needing to recruit for external talent. So those are some of the wins. What I noticed with some of the intentions is, so some of the intentions that I've talked about, the mindsets I talked about on the last slide, you know, development, growth, learning, upskilling, that was certainly there. When we focus on the growth, the others then tend to follow. So you will then get efficiency. You will then get as an output trust. You will then get as an output freed up time and collaboration. So this, if you see this as the starting point, you will find that the others will follow. So it's really helpful for us to tap into our mindsets. Now, many of you, when you were writing in the comments into the chat box in the pre-survey, in the pre-webinar, you talked about your team. So when you think about the Delegate for Growth mindset, the key questions that you can be asking yourself and also setting up to talk to your team are, who did I learn great delegation from? You know, we all have different perspectives on it. Who did I learn it from? What beliefs do I have about it? What makes it good? And when we start to have those conversations as a team, we can really start to build common ground as to what we collectively believe good delegation looks like. And that starts to shift and move this sort of responsibility that you can have as a leader to go, I have to delegate well. It's about how do we do delegation well together? And that's the shift from the I space into the we space. Okay. So when we get that right, it really does start to move things on. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions at this point in time, there's anything that you want clarifying, do pop it into the Q&A box and Robin can start to get a summary and see the themes so that he can prompt me at the end. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second part. So the second part is about stabilizing your inner self. So this is like the mainsail of the boat. One of the first things I learned when sailing was heading out into open water. We'd always raise up the mainsail, even if we were under motor and we weren't sailing. It just creates that stability. And this is about you. So really about stabilizing your inner self is doing the inner work on yourself. And I've split this into two different areas. Firstly, around core skills. So developing core skills in the key transferable skills which are used in delegation. And I've listed those as listening, questioning, articulation, clarification and prioritization. And in your workbooks, you'll see that I've done a from good to great so that you can score yourselves and you can see where you're at for these particular core skills. Now, we use these skills all the time. So we're using them all the time across our workload. So they're obviously not unique to delegation. What's interesting and often what happens with delegation is it's how our values show up that then affect how we're able to put those core skills that we have into practice. So I talk about it as, how do your values flavor your behavior? How do they sometimes help you behave in the way that you want to, and sometimes hinder? And I've just given a few examples here so that you can see here some values. Now the values that you can create, and there are very many different names for values, and you can find often things which can help you work out your values either online, but sometimes the best way is just to look back at how you behave and to really sort of do some focus work around what values were showing up in particular instances. So let's just do a quick hands up on who has heard themselves say, I'm no good at delegation. So we'll just do a quick hands up. Who sort of says, oh, I'm no good at doing delegation. I'm no good at delegating. And Robin, if you can just share for me if that's a question that resonates, or perhaps it doesn't resonate so much with this audience.
It does to an extent. We're hovering around the late 20s of people who responded to say that. Yeah.
So what it can do, what it can be helpful to do is to say, is to shift to, actually, I notice that my sometimes my desire for helpfulness gets in the way of clarifying or prioritizing. I notice that my desire, my value of harmony, means that I don't sometimes clarify either. I'm not clear in what I prioritize for somebody else. So if I just run through a few examples of those, so autonomy and self-sufficiency, if you value that and you value being left to your own devices to work it out, to have that freedom, you may leave it to somebody else to work it out too, because you value that. Once you have conscious awareness that that is your value, you can then find out if somebody else values that too, and therefore find out if they want to work in that way. They might want to not be left on their own. They might have a value of connection, which means they want to have somebody there with them, alongside them, for more than you would naturally want to. Helpfulness. Helpful people are really, they want to give you all the examples of how to do it, and they'll tell you, oh, well, here's a tip here and here's a tip here. The difficulty with that is that may then limit what somebody else is able to do, because they're now so full of tips that they're not thinking it through for themselves. So sometimes being super helpful means you're not really listening or questioning where somebody else is and what they need when you're delegating. Quality and standards, if I just jump onto another one down below, it can make it difficult to hand over work knowing that you yourself can do it better. And this can be a really hard one. It's just like, well, why would I give it to somebody else when I know I can do it better? So on the next slide, we're just going to go into a few more examples of that. So every value has an upside and a dark side. So just let you sort of scan through those. And perhaps as I'm talking through this slide, you might be noticing what your value might be and what the dark side of that value might be. Key thing about our values is that they do require us to take responsibility for them. They require us to know what they are, to be able to articulate our needs around them and to invite others to help support us in meeting those needs. So we're back to core skills of almost like listening to yourself, articulation. And the trick is really to turn the dark side into a growth opportunity. So if I give some examples around that. So if you really value self-sufficiency, you might be saying something to somebody, you might be saying to your direct report or to somebody you're delegating to, I really value self-sufficiency and would love to see you being able to do this under your own steam with little input from me. Would you be willing to give that a go? What would you need from me to give that a go under your own steam? So we're inviting, we're articulating, this is what I see as my need. I'm saying what I would like, and then I'm inviting you to support me in meeting that need. And this shifts it. A few of you had questions around, how do I not sound overbearing when I'm delegating? And this is really one of the tricks of articulation is to go, let me position this and see this as growth. Let me give you another example. So I noticed this is for somebody who perhaps values harmony and therefore minimizes conflict, avoids rocking the boat, will tend to delegate to people who they know will just get on with it without being perhaps having a more challenging, a more difficult conversation around that. So you might be phrasing that in words like, I notice I avoid awkward conversations and this holds me back from asking you to take on a bit more. Would you be willing to share with me how I can best approach this type of conversation with you? We're inviting somebody in to tell us what will make it easier, better, simpler for them. But we're at the same time, we're taking responsibility for our own values. The key one for me was my team, and I can visualize my first team would always say I was always in the detail. So I have to give one that's about detail. Because I would always be going, I want to know all the details. So now I might phrase that with knowing all the small details helps me chill and step back. Would you be willing to help me find a way of updating me so that I can then leave you to it and we can build that trust together? So it's that kind of, we're working in a much more collaborative space than, as I say, that autocratic leadership, top down. I've decided what's going to be done and this is how you're going to do it. And that's the real shift that we're seeing in terms of leadership. This way then, when you talk about delegation, you can really start to say, actually, in my delegation style, this is what I'm working on. I'm really paying attention to my values. I'm really paying attention to some of my skill set. So this is the inner work for each of us. So again, just thinking about putting in into the Q&A box any questions that you've got. And I can see that there's been a comment of whether these are examples are written down in text anywhere. So certainly we can share a post-webinar document with some of the ones and the phrasing that I've just done so that you haven't, if you've not scribbled them down, I'll include a few more as well. What struck me when I was looking through some of the responses to the question of what does good delegation look like, that we could see some of those values showing up in that. So let me just read you a couple of examples of the responses. So this is without judgment about those. We're just looking in to see the values that might be there. So here's an example of what somebody wrote. Delegation is a collaborative effort to reach a goal where team members have a sense of ownership and empowerment. So, great delegation is a collaborative effort to reach a goal where team members have a sense of ownership and empowerment. So what might be important there? So I pick out collaboration and autonomy. Let me read you a second one. There is a clear description of the task or work to be completed with a realistic timeline and a route of escalation review before final release of work. Delegated work is level appropriate or provides a stretch opportunity to team members. It has quite a different feel to it. So again, it's we all have these different perspectives, and perhaps what's valued by this person is order and growth. So when we start to have the conversations around our mindsets and our values, we can really start to build a common ground of delegation, rather than going, well, I know how I delegate, but what works for you? So let's talk about building that common ground together. So I think this is probably one of the most important frameworks within this. And this works well whether you're delegating to a direct report or whether you are delegating to a peer or upwards. It's a really useful framework to just hold in mind. This basically means that we take away the guesswork. We are talking about the norms, the rules, how we're going to manage delegation together. There is absolutely no need for it all to sit on the shoulders of the leader. It is a two-way exchange process, and therefore the rules of that two-way exchange process should be co-created and agreed. So the way that this framework works is we start in the middle with the mindset and values, and this is about exploring theirs and sharing yours. So you would have a conversation with your direct report, and you can use this either in the moment, but I would really recommend that you take some time and you put time aside to say, let's talk about how we want to use delegation for growth. It fits in really well with that mindset and float the boat conversation that we had earlier. The next place we go to is discussing 4 key elements of motivation, competence, confidence, and capacity. So what is somebody's motivation for delegation? What do they want from delegation? Where does this fit within their career path? The competence, I think, is pretty clear. You know, what's your level of competence, and how do we know that you are operating in your level of competence, and what level of stretch do you want in that? What confidence do you then have around something, and what capacity do you have? The capacity one then leads you into that skill set of prioritization. How can we help? What prioritization needs to be done here in order to support you to have the capacity to take on something? Risk. There is always risk. There is risk to both of you in this. You're both stepping outside of your comfort zone to do something differently, to delegate. And it's about identifying what the risk is, the risk to you, to the other, and also to the company. And then if you know what the risks are, you can put some checkpoints in place to plan for that. You might go, well, there's quite a lot of risk in this. Let's actually put in a checkpoint so that we can both take responsibility for that risk. And then the final part of the model is accompany, amplify, and absolute clarity. This is about how do you accompany each other? How do you stay in contact through the process, through the task, particularly if it's a longer task or if there is high risk? What does that look like? What does witnessing and seeing each other through this look like? So you're agreeing that feedback loop that needs to happen. How do you amplify each other? How, as a leader, do you amplify to your peers about the great work that somebody is doing in your team? How, if you are the delegee and the direct report in that team, how do you go, oh, it's amazing, I've been given this fantastic opportunity. What do you want to amplify about each other to your network? That's the growth. You're really cheering on. You're being the cheerleader for each other. And the final one then is absolute clarity. And this is just like going, are we both on the same page? Are we clear? Do we both have what we need in order to move forward? So we're now moving on to the 4th section, which is to calm the sea of uncertainty. And nobody really likes it sailing on a choppy sea. It's not particularly pleasant. But equally, if it's too calm, it's really boring as well, because there's typically no wind and you're not going anywhere and you're bobbing around and you've got to go under motor. So we're looking for conditions which are I'll come on to talk about safe uncertainty. So only leave ambiguous and uncertain what is uncertain. There is enough uncertainty in this world at the moment to not be clear about things. And that is particularly amplified again by working virtually. We do not have all of the other bits of information through seeing things happening in the office and the body language and those in-between moments that we can calibrate. We really do need to be much, much more explicit than we did before we moved virtually and hybrid. So only leave ambiguous and uncertain what is uncertain, and only make certain what needs to be. So when we walk through the model of safe uncertainty, I want you to think about where the risk sits when you delegate. Do you minimize the risk to yourself? Do you minimize the risk to somebody else? There's a possibility that if you minimize the risk to both of you, you are working in a safe, certain way. You're being really explicit about everything that needs to be done. And that can have a side effect of your direct report going on to autopilot, boredom, passive learning, and going through the motions. The other side of that, because we sometimes think, well, when we've made everything certain, we've made it really safe. But actually, sometimes when we've made things so certain, we've made things really unsafe. We've taken people into the space where they are trying to second guess exactly how I want something done, what the end result should look like. And that can create learned helplessness. So if you're seeing in somebody that they're just going at the first opportunities, go, I don't know how to do this. They're not really thinking things through. It may be because you are creating so much certainty that it's leading them to be in that place, that when they do something that you're not happy with, they feel quite judged and they feel quite defensive. So worth thinking about when you look at the output, when you look at somebody's, and when you really listen between for the body language of what is happening with your direct reports, it can give you clues as to about whether you are perhaps giving too much certainty and not enough uncertainty. Now, obviously, there is another side to that. There is the unsafeness that can come from a lack of certainty. And that really is, we look at chaos, it can feel dangerous, it can lead to complete inaction and fear. So if somebody is not doing anything at all, it's likely because there is just too much uncertainty for them. If they haven't started, they just don't know where to start. It's beyond where they are at in their ability. So where we're aiming for is sufficient uncertainty so that we're into the learning zone, and we are also creating that safety. So that safety can come through the conversation, the development conversation that we've had beforehand. It can support that engagement, the creativity, the risk-taking, adaptability and resilience. So all the kind of qualities that we're looking for so that it becomes, we are really in that growth zone and developing others. So Robin, if you just want to launch the poll, I'm curious to see which zone you see yourselves in. When you think about what you get back, how you are, do you create safe uncertainty, unsafe uncertainty, or are you on the, I create a lot of certainty and sometimes it leads to safety and sometimes I can see that maybe people feel unsafe with that. Okay, Robin, so what's the poll showing us?
I'm just going to share the results for you all now, so you should be able to see this in a moment. There you go. Has that come through?
Safe certainty and safe uncertainty. So that's fantastic to see that 37% of you feel that you're operating in that safe uncertainty box. And I think the safe certainty box is one that is a really easy place to be, particularly if you are a newer or less experienced manager. Then that can be a place that you go to because you want it to all be, you want the risk to be managed. And what I would encourage you encourage you to do is really think about what risk can you allow when you have that risk conversation as part of that development framework that I shared. Really start to think about, well, what risk is there in this and how do we manage that? And then that will support you to give less certainty instead of saying how things need to be done. Okay. So another framework that can help you with this as well is the Clarify framework. And this is about what is it that you choose to clarify. So there's two things I've built this into. There's what needs to be clarified for you and for the other, and there's purpose and expectation. So I prefer to start with purpose when I'm delegating. There is no right or wrong again to this, but in my experience, it helps to do both purpose and expectation. So this might be, why am I choosing to delegate this? For some of you, it's because you're tight on time. So be honest about it. You know, there's no point telling somebody you're delegating for another reason other than I'm really stretched at the moment and this is why I'm delegating this. You might then go on to say it's a priority for the company and it's going to make XYZ difference. So what contribution is it going to make to the company? So I know some of you in your questions asked, how do I not sound overbearing? You don't sound overbearing or demanding because you are talking about why this matters to the company. It's not just about why it matters to you. A lovely other way of talking about delegation and the purpose is I'm delegating to you because we've talked about how this fits in with your growth plan and your career plan, and this is an amazing opportunity. So that's another really lovely purpose to be talking about. The expectation, I know a number of you mentioned in your comments, you mentioned the SMART, tasks should be all SMART. They should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and targetable, and time-orientated. So the expectation, this is just a different way of framing that. This is like, when by, what standard, how, with whom. So if you know that you have that time is really important, this is the place to say it. If you know that standard or the quality of something is really important, because it will have an impact if it's not to that standard, then it's really important to say that. And you might want to then put in checkpoints around that standard as well. So you might say, it's really important that we hit XYZ quality on this, or that we meet the framework that's already in place by the company. I'd like to, let's check in and see how you're doing at it at the halfway point. With whom is also a really important thing. People often assume that because you've given them a piece of work, they have to do it on their own. So be explicit. If you invite other people in, this is what you need to be working on. And so the you question around expectation here is, what matters most to me here is X. So what matters about how you do this to me is this. And that's a really, that connects and is that honesty and that vulnerability. And then the check-in with the other person is, what is your understanding, confidence, capacity to do this? And this is where you really need to use those listening skills. You need to listen beneath the yes. So if the yes doesn't feel congruent, catch it in the moment and say, I can hear you saying yes, and my sense is that there's something that's not a yes. There's a sense that you need something a bit more. What might that be? Create that opportunity and permission. So it has been a whistle-stop tour today. We have, this is about the workbook. This is a start, but I really hope you'll go on to anchor some of these key principles, to adopt the mindset, to look at how you can work on your inner self, to think about what kind of different conversations you can have about delegation outside at a separate time from the actual task of delegation happening, and that you can work on that supporting safe uncertainty and calming any unnecessary uncertainty. So I think, Robin, it's probably a good place for me to pause. I'm just doing a quick time check. We've got about 10 minutes to take some questions. What's been coming into the Q&A box?
Okay. So thank you first and foremost on that. You've crammed a lot of frameworks into 50 minutes, which I'm very thankful for, and I'm sure the people on this session are as well. But yes, we do have a few minutes for calls, so I will talk less and ask more questions. So let's get started here. So how can delegating create efficiency when you have no more resources?
Say that again, Robin. How can delegation create efficiency?
Yes.
When you have no more resources. My hunch about that one is that if you sit down with who you are delegating with and the team of people that you have, and you have a conversation about delegation, you talk about the mindset and you talk about how delegation can support efficiency, then, and as in the context of growth, then that would be the starting place. As to where that conversation would go, that's, you know, at this point, it would be impossible to say. But I think if you focus on the growth, efficiency does come as an output. It might take a little bit of time up front, but efficiency will follow.
Okay. I hope that answers that question. If it hasn't, or you'd like a bit more clarification, we just pop that into the chat box, and I'd be happy to ask Felicity again. Also, to anybody here, if you would like to ask a question live to Felicity and to the group, just raise your virtual hand, and I'm sure, and we'd be very happy to have you on. You can ask that question live. But in the meantime, so has said a brilliant point about articulation being used when delegating. But what other tools would you signpost people? Excuse me. What other tools would you signpost people to support great articulation? Sorry, I couldn't get that one right. In delegation conversations.
So to support great articulation and delegation, well, the first thing is self-awareness. So if you don't have awareness of self, it's really hard to know what you're going to articulate. And then I think the key thing with articulation, different things help different people. For some, in my experience as a coach, writing out in advance how they might articulate it, practicing in a safe environment with family and friends, and articulation of self can be really helpful. What you're aiming for is to articulate in the moment. So sometimes we have those amazing thoughts of, I could have said this afterwards. So capturing what you would have said afterwards will help you then in the next moment when it shows up, for you to articulate it when you're in person with somebody.
That's just come through. How do you delegate to peers when they have a different role without doing the work alongside them?
Well, I hope that from the frameworks that we've shared, that you might find something, Zoe, that will help you with that. What I found with project work is that I was actually better at delegating within peer-to-peer project work, because I took the time to have the conversations around what motivates you in this project. What's your competence? What's your confidence? What's your capacity? And therefore building that shared agreement. So really using that development conversation, and particularly accompanying, amplifying, and giving absolute clarity. Those were really key to working with peers and delegating.
How do you encourage your team to challenge up, particularly colleagues very early on in their careers?
Sorry, could you just say that again, Robin? Of
course. How do you encourage your team to challenge up, particularly very early on in their careers?
Yeah, I mean, nobody encouraging challenging up. It's about being receptive. So listening and inviting in a different opinion to the one that you have is a really good place to start. So that example I've got where I gave when somebody says yes, but you can tell that they don't really mean yes. And you can go, so what if there was a no? So you invite in the opposite opinion, and it can just help to go, so if there was a no in this room, what would it sound like? What would that voice be like? What would it be saying? So you invite the opposite to what you've been saying, and that allows them to start challenging, and it demonstrates that you are open to different perspectives.
I just check here, someone just asking for just some clarification over the meaning of creating certainty. Okay, could you just remind us about that one again?
Creating certainty, or too much certainty.
What do we mean by creating certainty?
Creating certainty. So when we're looking at certainty, there are things which are absolutely certain in a task that needs to be done. I might need to, there might be a specific, suddenly remembered about loading sort of promotions onto the system, you know, for a big retailer. That promotion has to be loaded in a certain way. Certain data is required, and it has to be done in a certain time frame. Those things are absolutely certain. So we might say, when you do this, you need to do these things, because otherwise it will be it will be wrong. You know, for the standard that we have in this company, it won't meet that standard. However, as to when they choose to fit it into their time in that week, that is uncertain. That is free to be determined by the person doing the job, as long as they do it by the deadline. So you're looking for, don't make things over certain if they don't need to be. Don't make them explicit because you need them to be, to manage your risk levels. So it's just about knowing and choosing what you make certain, as opposed to unnecessarily making too many things certain.